The fog clung to the Appalachian Mountains like a living thing, swallowing the crooked paths and gnarled trees as though the forest itself wanted to keep secrets buried. Deep within this suffocating green labyrinth, a landowner's pride had led him to a choice so dark that even the wind seemed to whisper warnings. His daughter, once sheltered by the polished floors of a grand estate, had been handed over to a man whose very name was spoken only in fear. The villagers spoke of him in hushed tones, of a feral figure who roamed the woods, whose hands had touched things no outsider could imagine, and whose eyes gleamed with knowledge that belonged to neither man nor beast. She had followed the winding trail, hard hammering against ribs that the world had always judged too soft, too round, too wrong. The cabin rose out of the mist like a monument to dread, its crooked timbers and shattered windows offering no welcome, only a promise of the unimaginable. At first, his touch was oddly gentle, his words almost soothing, but the air inside that broken home carried a different rhythm, an ancient cadence that made the skin crawl, a pulse that seemed to bend her very senses. At night, the whispers began. At first, faint and fragmented, but they grew louder, circling the walls, crawling into corners, twisting her thoughts into knots she could not unravel. And beneath it all, a transformation was already stirring, one she could feel but could not name. Something in those woods, something in him, was reshaping her, and the forest was listening. The landowner's decision to give his daughter to the feral man was not born of a single moment of cruelty but rather the slow accumulation of pride, obsession, and societal pressure that had built within him over decades. He had always been acutely aware of appearances, of the way neighbors would whisper behind his back and judge his family by the narrow standards of beauty and propriety that governed the isolated Appalachian Valley where they lived. His daughter's body, once a source of comfort and maternal pride, had become a burden in his mind, a constant reminder of imperfection in a world that demanded conformity. He could not bear the thought of her presence reflecting badly on him, nor could he tolerate the notion that she might live a life unshaped by his authority. In his eyes, the feral man represented both an outlet and a solution, a reclusive, misunderstood figure who had lived entirely outside the norms of society, whose strength and peculiar reputation could reshape her into something useful, something that would erase the shame he imagined. The process of making this decision was itself cold and calculated. He observed his daughter with a clinical detachment, measuring her movements, her habits, even the way she ate, as though she were a specimen rather than a person. He weighed the opinions of neighbors, the murmurs that slipped from taverns and porches like smoke, and convinced himself that transferring her into the custody of a man who existed on the fringes of the known world would somehow be an act of pragmatism rather than malice. He rehearsed the plan in the shadows of his study, imagining the journey through the dense forest, the cabin hidden among the trees, and the feral man waiting, a living tool to correct what he perceived as flaw. There was a moment of hesitation, a flicker of conscience perhaps, but it was quickly extinguished by the fire of his obsession with control and reputation. In his mind, he was orchestrating a rescue from inadequacy, a reformation that would transform his daughter into a reflection of what he deemed acceptable. Every justification he conjured, every rationalization about her future, about the man's supposed abilities, only reinforced his certainty. He did not see fear in her eyes or the way she stiffened at the thought of the journey, he saw only the necessity of action, the imperative to maintain his family's standing, and the opportunity to wield power over a life that he believed was slipping beyond his control. The moment he made the choice, he crossed a threshold, committing to a path that was irrevocable. He gathered what he believed she would need, organized the journey through the twisting trails, and arranged for her departure as if preparing a transaction, not realizing that the consequences of this decision would extend far beyond appearances and pride, touching realms of darkness he could not yet comprehend. The whispers in the village began almost immediately after the landowner's decision became known, spreading through the narrow streets and clustered homesteads like wildfire carried on the wind. The townsfolk, already steeped in the superstitions and fears that the mountains nurtured, spoke of the feral man with a mixture of awe and dread, their voices dropping to hushed tones whenever his name was mentioned. Some claimed they had glimpsed him from a distance, a hulking figure moving silently through the trees, his eyes reflecting the cold logic of someone who belonged more to the wilderness than to humanity. Others swore they had heard strange sounds at night, low guttural cries and unnatural noises that could not be traced to any known animal, suggesting rituals or practices that defied comprehension. The daughter's impending journey became the subject of gossip and speculation, and every whispered warning seemed to carry a subtle accusation, as if questioning why a father would willingly consign his child to such an uncertain fate. Mothers clutched their children closer when the story was recounted over fences and fires, while older men shook their heads and muttered about curses and long-buried secrets in the forest. These voices in the village did more than warn, they built a web of anticipation and dread around the event, shaping the perception of the forest and the men who lived within it. Each retelling grew more elaborate, as stories often do in small, isolated communities where reality and rumor blur, until the feral man was portrayed as something less than human, a creature capable of acts both horrific and impossible. Even those who had once been friendly with the landowner hesitated to approach, caught between social propriety and instinctive fear, unsure if offering counsel or protest would bring the daughter back safely or draw the forest's unseen gaze upon them. The daughter herself heard fragments of these whispers, carried to her ears through passing travelers or servants who hesitated to speak directly, and she felt a growing sense of isolation and apprehension. The warnings painted the journey ahead not simply as a passage through trees and terrain but as a crossing into a realm where human rules and morality no longer applied, where the boundary between safety and danger was invisible, and where the intentions of the feral men remained unknowable. Every whispered tale added weight to her fear, constructing in her mind a shadowed image of what awaited, a cabin enmeshed in fog and secrets, a man whose reputation alone seemed capable of bending the world to his will. The village's murmurs became a chorus of caution, a relentless undercurrent that pressed against the edges of reason and sanity, filling the spaces of her thoughts with questions that had no answers and shadows that could not be outrun, leaving her both terrified and strangely compelled to face the darkness that the mountains had quietly been preparing for her all along. The journey into the woods began under a sky heavy with gray clouds, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, as if the forest itself were aware of the passage that was about to occur. Every step took the daughter further from the familiar, farther from the stone walls of her father's estate, the comfort of the village paths, and the reassuring presence of neighbors who, even in their whispers, had been the last tether to ordinary life. The trail wound through tangled undergrowth, roots like grasping fingers curling across the narrow path, and low-hanging branches that scraped against her skin as though testing her resolve. The deeper she moved, the more the sunlight struggled to penetrate the dense canopy above, leaving her in a perpetual twilight where shapes shifted and shadows seemed to follow, making the forest feel alive and watchful. Occasionally, the distant calls of birds or the snap of a twig underfoot punctuated the silence, reminding her that the world beyond these trees no longer applied and that she had entered a domain governed by rules she could not yet comprehend. The path was uneven and treacherous, forcing her to navigate slippery slopes and narrow ledges with every ounce of caution, while a growing awareness of the isolation weighed heavily upon her. The further she traveled, the more the sense of inevitability pressed down, a feeling that each step was taking her not just deeper into the woods but further from the possibility of return. Her father's instructions echoed in her mind, cold and detached, emphasizing the necessity of reaching the man's dwelling without hesitation, yet offering no comfort against the oppressive quiet that surrounded her. The forest seemed to close in at times, twisting familiar sounds into dissonant echoes that made her heart race, while unseen creatures rustled through the underbrush, their presence only hinted at, feeding the imagination with the worst possibilities. At certain points, the trail became nearly unrecognizable, overgrown with ferns and brambles that tore at her clothing, leaving her marked by the journey itself. Despite the physical exhaustion, a mental tension gripped her, a sense of anticipation mingled with dread, knowing that each mile brought her closer to the men whose reputation was as terrifying as it was enigmatic. The journey was not merely a physical crossing but a psychological one, stripping away layers of familiarity, safety, and innocence, leaving her exposed to the unknown in every sense. Even the air carried a strange quality, heavy with moisture and the faint metallic tang of something ancient hidden beneath the forest floor, an odor that seemed to hint at the presence of human hands shaping the wild in ways long forgotten. Every step forward reinforced the reality of her predicament. There would be no turning back, no comforting voices, no easy reprieve, and with each passing moment, the shadow of the feral man's cabin loomed ever closer, a destination that promised to alter everything she had known, and perhaps everything she thought she could endure. The arrival at the cabin was like stepping into a world where the rules of civilization had been deliberately abandoned, a place where time itself seemed to have been twisted by isolation and neglect. As she approached, the structure revealed itself through the fog like a dark, jagged silhouette, its crooked timbers leaning at odd angles, windows fractured and clouded with years of grime, and a roof sagging under the weight of moss and fallen leaves. The smell hit her before she even reached the door, a pungent mixture of damp wood, decay, and something else she could not name, an undercurrent of iron or rot that made her stomach churn. Every surface bore the marks of survival in a place that had known no visitors, nails protruding haphazardly from the walls, boards patched with scavenged planks, and strange symbols etched into the wood that hinted at meanings she could not begin to interpret. Bones, small and large, were scattered in corners and along the threshold, some identifiable as animals, others more ambiguous, and their presence suggested that the men who lived here viewed life and death through a lens entirely removed from her own experience. The door creaked ominously as she pushed it open, revealing an interior both cramped and cavernous, shadowed by the dim light that filtered through broken windows, and filled with objects whose purpose she could not discern: jars of preserved substances, tools worn to the point of indistinction, and remnants of meals long past. There was a pervasive quiet, broken only by the occasional drip of water from the roof and the whisper of wind squeezing through the gaps, a silence that pressed against her chest and made her breath shallow. The air was thick with the weight of abandonment, yet beneath it was an energy, subtle but undeniable, as if the cabin itself exhaled a watchful awareness, a sentience shaped by years of solitude and secrecy. Every step she took on the uneven floorboards seemed amplified, echoing in a space that had not known human traffic for a long time, her presence both intruding and being observed. Shadows clung to the corners like living things, and every object suggested stories of acts she dared not imagine, hinting at practices and rituals that had grown from necessity or obsession into something ritualized and dark. Even before encountering the man himself, the cabin communicated a warning: it was a domain he controlled completely, a space molded to his desires, fears, and methods, indifferent to the norms or morality of the outside world. She could feel the weight of its history pressing in on her, each creaking beam and cracked window pane a silent testimony to a life lived apart, a life that had hardened and warped the inhabitant into a being both human and other, familiar yet terrifyingly alien. The threshold she crossed was not merely physical, it was a boundary into a reality where survival, obsession, and power intertwined, and stepping over it marked the beginning of a transformation she could neither predict nor resist, a journey that promised to challenge every certainty she had ever held about the world outside these woods. The first signs of horror emerged almost imperceptibly, beginning with the smallest of gestures and the faintest of alterations to her daily existence, but they quickly accumulated into a creeping sense of dread that gnawed at the edges of her mind. At first, the feral man's behavior seemed oddly considerate, almost caring, as he guided her through the cabin, showing her where to sleep and how to navigate the dim, cluttered spaces without tripping over the scattered debris. His voice, low and measured, offered instructions that sounded helpful, even gentle, masking a precision that was unsettling in its calmness. But beneath the surface of these initial actions was a pattern of control that she could not yet name, a meticulous attention to her body, to her habits, to the way she moved and reacted, as though he were studying her the way one might examine a specimen, cataloging each detail for purposes she could not fathom. Meals were prepared with care, yet they carried a strange, ritualized quality, portions calculated, ingredients chosen not for nourishment alone but for effects she could not immediately discern. The texture, the smell, even the timing of consumption seemed to follow rules she was unaware of, and with each meal, she began to sense a subtle alteration, a nudging of her body and mind that left her both bewildered and wary. Occasionally, he would touch her, not harshly, but deliberately, in ways that highlighted areas of flesh he considered flawed or in need of correction, leaving her skin tingling long after contact, a sensation that blurred the line between attention and violation. Objects in the cabin suggested other practices, items whose purpose was never explained but which he handled with an intimate familiarity, as though they were extensions of his will rather than mere tools. At night, his presence became more intrusive, shadows seemed to move with him, and strange noises accompanied his work in the dark, a rhythm that insinuated itself into her subconscious, leaving her dreaming of shapes and movements she could not fully remember or describe. The sense of being constantly observed began to suffuse every moment, an invisible pressure that she could neither escape nor confront, and it forced her into a state of hyper-awareness, where every sound, every flicker of movement, every subtle shift in his demeanor became a potential warning or threat. Slowly, the cabin's oppressive atmosphere merged with his own meticulous manipulation, creating an environment in which horror was not announced by screams or overt violence but insinuated through ritual, calculation, and the quiet assertion of power over her body. It was a terror that crept through the mundane, the everyday, bending ordinary acts into mechanisms of control and reshaping her perception so that even the familiar, the act of eating, sleeping, or walking, became laden with unease, a constant reminder that in this place, nothing was accidental, and everything she experienced was already being shaped by the man's hidden, incomprehensible intent. The daughter's transformation began subtly, almost imperceptibly at first, as if the cabin and its occupant were orchestrating a process she could neither fully understand nor resist. Her body, once familiar and steady, began to respond to the feral man's routines and the strange regimen he imposed upon her, changing in ways that were both physical and psychological. Meals, once simple sustenance, were calculated instruments, blends of herbs, roots, and substances he claimed would strengthen her but which carried effects that left her muscles stiff, her limbs heavier, her skin tinged with an unnatural pallor. At first, the changes were minor, a slight swelling here, a rigidity there, and she dismissed them as fatigue or the stress of the journey, but gradually they compounded, becoming impossible to ignore. Her reflection, once a source of private comfort or critique, became a battlefield. She studied herself in the cracked mirror, noticing contours that seemed reshaped, flesh that reacted unpredictably, and a posture that carried the weight of something imposed rather than naturally earned. The cabin's atmosphere and the man's presence exerted a pressure beyond mere observation. Every corner of the dwelling, every object, every ritualized motion seemed to reinforce a rhythm she could not resist, as though the walls themselves were participating in her alteration. Nights brought no relief. Dreams were infiltrated by strange visions of her own body shifting, bending, and contorting under forces she could not name, leaving her waking with muscles sore, joints stiff, and a lingering sense that she was no longer entirely herself. Her thoughts became entangled with these bodily changes, an anxious awareness that she could neither control nor fully understand, and the man's interventions, always framed as guidance or correction, seemed increasingly invasive, directed at aspects of her being that were intimate, private, and previously untouchable. The transformation was as much psychological as it was corporeal, as the daughter began to internalize the rituals, the commands, the subtle manipulations, accepting them as inevitable while simultaneously fearing the trajectory they imposed. Each day she moved differently, breathed differently, responded to stimuli in ways that felt preordained rather than voluntary, a creeping realization that her autonomy was slipping even as she tried to hold onto it. Observing the changes in herself provoked a mixture of fascination and horror, a duality that heightened the tension of her existence within the cabin's walls, where every moment was structured to shape her according to the feral man's design. The body she had known, the person she had been, became a canvas for an experiment whose methods were obscure, whose intentions were opaque, and whose results were already manifesting in the slow, relentless remodeling of flesh, posture, and perception. It was a transformation that blurred the lines between nurture and coercion, between care and control, and as the days stretched into weeks, she began to understand that this process was irreversible, that the man's influence reached into the very architecture of her being, bending her into something both horrifying and unrecognizable, something that existed solely within the dominion of the woods and the cabin he ruled. The nights in the cabin were unlike anything she had ever experienced, suffused with an oppressive quiet that seemed to hum with a life of its own, a subtle vibration that pressed against her eardrums and rattled the edges of her mind. At first, she dismissed the sounds as the ordinary creaks and groans of an old, decaying structure, the settling of timber and the whisper of wind through broken windows. But over time, the noises became distinct, deliberate, almost sentient, low murmurs that seemed to circle the room, footsteps that echoed when no one walked, and whispers that teased the edge of comprehension, half-formed syllables that might have been voices or might have been the forest itself speaking through the cabin walls. Sometimes the sounds were distant, like faint conversation beyond the walls, and other times they were immediate, pressing against her ears with an intimacy that made her flinch, a sensation that blurred the line between inside and outside, between safety and intrusion. Shadows stretched in impossible directions, cast by the flickering light of the fire or lanterns, forming shapes that resembled human figures but moved with unnatural fluidity, and she began to doubt whether the figures were real or a creation of her own mind. The whispers seemed to respond to her thoughts, rising in intensity when she tried to sleep, twisting her dreams into fragmented, nightmarish sequences where she wandered endlessly through trees, corridors, and hidden rooms, always pursued by unseen presences that watched and waited. Occasionally, a soft, urgent call would drift from somewhere in the cabin, a voice that sounded almost human but carried a rasping undertone that made her spine prickle, and she would freeze, heart hammering, unsure whether to obey it or ignore it. The effect was cumulative, a slow erosion of certainty, leaving her disoriented and vulnerable, as if the very air conspired to bend her perceptions. Even when the feral man was present, his movements calm and methodical, she could not escape the sensation that the cabin held secrets that he did not fully disclose, that the walls themselves had absorbed centuries of silence and suffering and now murmured reminders of their hidden knowledge. As days and nights blurred, she began to anticipate the voices, almost welcoming them despite the fear they provoked, because they reminded her that the world extended beyond the immediate confines of her torment and hinted at forces she could neither confront nor understand. Her own sense of self began to fray under the constant intrusion. Reality, memory, and imagination became indistinguishable, and she questioned whether the cabin was merely a dwelling or a living entity, an extension of the feral man's will, a sentinel that observed, tested, and shaped her even in her sleep. The forest beyond, dense and unyielding, seemed to feed the whispers, carrying them through the walls and floorboards, a relentless reminder that the woods were not silent observers but active participants in her slow unraveling, and that every movement, every breath, every flicker of thought was subject to scrutiny, twisting her nights into a liminal space where fear and awareness intertwined. and where she could feel the presence of the unseen pressing in from every direction. Clues to the feral man's hidden past began to emerge in fragments, scattered like shards of a puzzle too grotesque to fully comprehend, and each revelation added weight to the mounting terror that gripped her every waking moment. At first, it was small details: a photograph yellowed with age, a journal whose pages were filled with precise but unsettling notations, strange implements arranged meticulously along a shelf, and marks on the walls that hinted at rituals or exercises whose purpose eluded her. The more she observed, the clearer it became that his life had been governed by a rigid system of secrecy and control, one that stretched far beyond the boundaries of the cabin and into the dark recesses of the surrounding woods. Tales she had once dismissed as village superstition began to coalesce into a tangible pattern. There were references in his writing to people who had come before her, their names faintly familiar from whispered rumors, and descriptions of practices that suggested a lineage of obsession passed down from one generation to the next. Some entries hinted at methods of bodily manipulation, controlling diet, posture, and movement, as well as psychological conditioning, all executed with an almost clinical precision that chilled her to the bone. The feral man himself became an enigma she could not fully interpret, simultaneously human and something beyond comprehension, shaped by forces both ancestral and self-imposed, and the logic behind his actions was as alien as the forest surrounding the cabin. Objects in the cabin seemed to act as anchors for his history: carved symbols, jars of preserved substances, and implements whose design suggested purposes beyond the ordinary, each carrying the residue of past practices and the memory of prior occupants. As she pieced these clues together, a horrifying image began to take shape, one of a man molded by generations of isolation, secrecy, and ritual, whose life had been devoted to mastery over both body and mind, a mastery that now encompassed her. The woods themselves seemed implicated in this hidden history, every gnarled tree, every shadowed grove, hinting at centuries of human presence and intervention, as though the landscape had been cultivated to serve as both protector and accomplice to his obsessions. Even the small, mundane elements, the way he handled tools, the organization of the cabin, the careful preservation of objects, told a story of continuity and deliberate practice, a life lived according to a set of rules and obsessions inherited and honed over decades. The deeper she looked, the more she realized that nothing about her presence in the cabin was accidental. Every step she had taken, every instruction she had received, was part of a carefully orchestrated design, a continuation of patterns that had existed long before she arrived and would continue long after. It was a realization that tightened the grip of fear around her chest, a chilling understanding that she had been drawn into a history that was at once intimate and incomprehensible, a lineage of control and transformation that extended far beyond the man himself, rooted in the darkest and most secretive corners of the Appalachian wilderness, and it left her with the haunting certainty that she had become an integral, unwilling participant in a story that had been unfolding for decades, a narrative written in silence, ritual, and shadow. The breaking point approached with a tension that coiled around her chest and refused to loosen, a culmination of fear, confusion, and the relentless pressure exerted by the cabin, the forest, and the men who ruled both with quiet, absolute authority. Days had bled into nights, and nights into a surreal continuum of whispers, shadows, and bodily changes she could no longer ignore, until the weight of it all pressed her to the brink of comprehension. Every sense had been sharpened, honed to a state of hyper-awareness, and every movement felt measured, as though the air itself dictated how she could breathe, walk, or even blink. The subtle manipulations of the feral man, once almost imperceptible, had grown increasingly intrusive. His touch, his words, his rituals, and the very rhythms of the cabin now pressed on her body and mind with an intensity that could no longer be dismissed as mere eccentricity. The forest beyond seemed to have drawn closer, its unseen eyes watching her every action, its unseen hands shaping the very space she occupied, as though the wilderness and the men had conspired over decades to orchestrate a transformation both physical and psychological. A moment came when a minor misstep, a gesture too slow, a glance in the wrong direction, triggered a response that laid bare the full extent of his control, and she realized that the autonomy she had clung to was an illusion, fragile and easily shattered. Panic surged through her, yet it was tempered by a creeping, horrifying fascination. Part of her could not look away from the reality of what was being done to her, could not resist watching herself change under forces she could neither understand nor counteract. Her body, once familiar, had become alien, a canvas upon which the man's precise, obsessive methods had left their mark, and the psychological toll of the cabin's whispers and shadows intensified the sense that she was both prisoner and participant in a design far beyond her comprehension. The culmination of these forces, ritual, manipulation, isolation, fear, and the slow erosion of her identity, brought her to a precipice where any decision seemed both impossible and unavoidable. Her mind oscillated between rebellion and resignation, between a desperate desire to escape and the understanding that escape might not exist, that the cabin, the forest, and the man's methods had woven her into a system she could not unravel. The tension mounted with every heartbeat, every creak of timber, every rustle in the darkened corners, until the world around her became a singular point of focus, the inevitability of confrontation, the necessity of recognition, and the stark realization that the moment of truth had arrived. The breaking point was not marked by violence or revelation alone but by the terrifying clarity that all the preceding days had led to a juncture where the future was uncertain, where survival and identity, fear and comprehension, control and submission, teetered in a delicate, horrifying balance, and where the next instant would determine whether she remained a passive instrument of forces beyond her understanding or whether she would confront, resist, or perhaps succumb entirely to the shadowed dominion that had been waiting for her since the very first step into the forest.